everyone. MJ Kinman, and welcome to my studio. It's wonderful to be here with you on this very first episode of our Diamonds and Drama Queens block of the month. You know, when the world shut down a year ago, I was really disappointed. I was heartbroken, basically, because I love in-person teaching. I love in-person events. There's such energy when you get people in a room that share the same passion and the same joy. And so when the world shut down and all my teaching gigs were canceled, I thought, you know what, there's got to be a way that we're still going to be able to do this. And so I went zoop, and I decided I was going to learn everything I could about Zoom meetings. I was going to learn everything I could about video creation and editing. I tell you what, last year was really a growth year, wasn't it? I think we all learned so much. And I really think that we learned patience in ourselves as well. And I think, there were some upsides to that. So here we are, our very first block of the month, Diamonds and Drama Queens. You know what? I didn't plan on having any kind of in-person live component to it, like a Zoom chat, but I'm open to that. I'm open to, hearing from you to see whether you might like that. I have another project that I'm doing called the Tiny Treasures Club. And I drop a pattern and then we meet an hour later. We talk about it. I give a little presentation. And then 2 weeks later, we actually get together and look at people's progress. So perhaps what we might want to do is think about doing kind of a mid-month meetup for the Diamonds and Drama Queens block of the month. And that way, then we can be, screen to screen, face to face, and we can meet each other. I think I would like that. So I'd like to hear from you as to whether you think that would be a good move, a good addition to this block of the month. The way the whole Diamonds and Drama Queens idea got started was that I had been doing what basically I love to do because I'm a geek. I'm a history nerd. And I was reading tons of books and stories about these gems and the people who'd been caught up in their orbit, and was simply amazed. And I thought, you know what, if I'm enjoying this so much, I bet other people would too. And so I thought, let's put together a program where I'll do a pattern inspired by a famous gemstone, and then we'll do a whole presentation around these wild figures. And so that's how the Diamonds and Drama Queens idea was born. It really brought together my love of history, my love of gemstones, and my love of quilting. And I'm loving that you are with me on this adventure. So one of the interesting things that I have learned as I've been doing all this research is that these stories keep overlapping. As I read about one of these drama queens, another drama queen kind of intersects, and then another one really kind of intersects with that story. And I shouldn't have been surprised, because gemstones, as fabulous as the ones we're going to talk about, are incredibly expensive. They can only be purchased by the very, very, very wealthy. And you know what F. Scott Fitzgerald said about the rich? He said, let me tell you about the very rich. They're different than you and me. And it's true. These birds are different, and they tend to flock together. They really tend to run in each other's social circles, because they want to be with people who aren't necessarily going to be after their money all the time. They want to have a mutual admiration for them as people rather than just for their money. Now, of course, some of these connections were born from a mutual admiration for their money, but they really tended to overlap. So for example, our first drama queen is Evelyn Walsh McLean, and she is primarily known as the owner, a longtime owner of the Hope Diamond. She wrote a book called Father Struck It Rich, and we're going to talk a little bit about her and her father a little bit in just a few minutes. But then sort of a special edition of her autobiography came out. It was called Queen of Diamonds, and it includes the Father Struck It Rich book, but there's a preface from her great grandson, and then there's an epilogue by someone who talks about, okay, the rest of the story. And so this is where I'm getting lots of this great information about Evelyn Walsh McLean. But as I was reading through this, I would run into these stories, such as a woman named Mrs. Hutton was kind of pestering Evelyn to get the ambassador to England, to the court of England, to introduce her and her daughter to the King of England, as they are wont to do. They have an introduction into the court. And the ambassador got a little miffed with Evelyn because she kept pestering him to do that. Well, as I kept reading, I realized that this Mrs. Hutton was none other than Marjorie Merriweather Post, who had married E.F. Hutton, right? That E.F. Hutton, and their daughter. And their daughter ended up being a famous actress, Dina Merrill. Beautiful, beautiful woman. And you know what? We're going to talk about Marjorie Merriweather Post because she has some spectacular gemstones. And I think some of the patterns that I'm going to do are going to be inspired by her fabulous gem collection. Doesn't that just knock your socks off? Absolutely gorgeous. Oh, and by the way, Marjorie Merriweather Post, Mrs. Hutton's niece, Barbara Hutton, also was a true drama queen. And we're going to have a pattern based on Barbara's life. So again, so we've got this intersection of Marjorie Merriweather Post and Barbara Hutton. Now, the second connection that I discovered was that they often threw these great parties. And one of the couples that they invited was James B. Duke and his wife, Nana Lean. And James B. Duke was, he admired the fact that Evelyn Walsh McLean would allow her children to play with the children of her staff, her hired help. And James Duke, also known as Buck Duke, was happy to hear about that because he realized, that's what we need to do for little Doris. Doris was their one and only child, and she was oftentimes spending her time only with adults. And he felt that she needed that wonderful interaction with children. And that little Doris was Doris Duke, the woman who became a billionaire when her father died. So we're going to do a story about Doris Duke and some of her fabulous jewelry as well. Now, here's a third connection. One night when Evelyn Walsh McLean and her husband, Ned, kind of her ne'er-do-well, not necessarily a stand-up guy. Yeah, he had a terrible, terrible drinking problem. And he was a very spoiled child growing up. And Evelyn, they ended up getting divorced. And again, we're going to talk about all this. But they were at a party. They were at a party at a woman who was kind of a society matron at the time. And he ticked off a guy by the name of Vincent Astor and his new wife. Now, Vincent Astor was the son of John Jacob Astor, who had gone down on the Titanic in 1905 and left all of his wealth to young Vincent. He inherited $60 million at the age of 20. Do you know how much that is today? 1.6 billion with a B dollars when he was 20 years old. Now, he went on to have a couple of more wives. He wasn't, again, probably the most upstanding, wasn't one of the nicer people in the world. And when he was older, he married a lovely young woman named Brooke Russell, and she became Brooke Astor, who was the grande dame of New York society in the 20th century. So we're going to do a pattern about Brooke Astor and her fabulous jewelry a little bit later. But again, another intersection, right? All of these people really kind of flocked together. And the last two connections I want to share with you is that, of course, she knew the Cartier brothers very, very well. She spent a lot of time in their showrooms in Paris, where she ended up buying the Hope and she ended up buying the Star of the East. I'm not sure if she bought the McLean diamond from the Cartiers. I'll have to do a little more research on that. She wrote in her autobiography this. She said, "One day when I was blue from all the trouble of making $1 million ends meet, I remembered my old prescription for that state of mind. Went to New York and asked Cartier to show me something fine. He then dazzled me with a ruby and diamond bracelet, one that owes its existence to the Depression. However, it's no use for anyone to chide me for loving jewels. I cannot help it if I have a passion for them. They make me feel comfortable and even happy. The truth is, when I neglect to wear jewels, astute members of my family call in the doctors because it's a sign I'm becoming ill." Now, the last connection I want to share with you is the one with the Duchess of Windsor. Her name was Wallis Simpson before she caught the eye and eventually married the King of England. King Edward VIII, he abdicated so he could marry the woman he loved. This was a woman who was indeed very much a drama queen, and we're going to do a piece on her and her fabulous jewelry. She actually ended up with the McLean diamond. So once Evelyn had passed away, Harry Winston bought all of her jewels, and the Duchess ended up with one of the pieces, and that was the McLean diamond. Another way that, as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the very, very wealthy are different than you and me, is that they played by a different set of rules. And Evelyn Walsh McLean, our first drama queen, knew this. She knew that law enforcement could be paid to look the other way. She knew that officials could be bribed to make decisions that helped them out. And she knew that scandals could be covered up with a nice fat check. In fact, in the last pages of her autobiography, she writes this. She wrote, "Not all the moral tests of life are tied up with money or the lack of it, but only the rich may be reckless, foolish, ignorant, and snap their fingers at the consequences. If you are not rich, the piper is at your door with his bill in the morning. The rich can defer their payments. They may easily delude themselves that they are not paying at all. The guardrails that a lot of us live by simply disappear with the rich, right? And that makes for very dangerous living. And that's why some of these stories can be so tragic, because there are very few guardrails. Now, for example, here's an example of a tragedy that happened in Evelyn's life when she was younger. In 1905, her little brother, Vincent, he was of driving age, and he was a wild one. He loved cars. He loved tinkering with them. He loved altering them, and he loved driving very, very, very fast. And oftentimes the law enforcement would look the other way because he was basically a Walsh. He was Vincent Walsh. He was Thomas Walsh's son. Well, one day, one August in 1905, Vincent and Evelyn and some friends of theirs were at a party at the Clam Bake Country Club in Rhode Island. And Vincent, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, wanted to drive Evelyn's gigantic Mercedes back home. Now, keep in mind, this is 1905. This is when the cars were giant, and they were really just for the rich and famous. It was years before Henry Ford was beginning to churn out the Model A's, right? The Tin Lizzies that he made for the people. So these cars were giant. Here's an example of a Mercedes, could be very much like the one that Evelyn drove and that Vincent drove that afternoon. So he was driving very fast. There were people in the front seat and the back seat. And in fact, their chauffeur was riding on the side of the car. What happened was, as they were going around a corner, they blew a tire. And at that point, the car hit a bridge, hit the boards of a bridge, and went out of control. And those wooden railings were no match for that gigantic ton of a car. The car went over the edge into the water. So did everyone else. Evelyn ended up underneath the car, and Vincent was killed. Evelyn had her leg broken in a couple of places, and their first attempt at healing her or surgery caused her to have just severe pain. And what had happened was the doc hadn't set it properly, right? He hadn't set the bone right. And so whenever she tried to put weight on it, it would slip and cause her tremendous, tremendous pain. And so she began easing that pain with morphine. The good news, though, is that she found another doctor who was able to go in, shave off those bones, set it with a steel plate, and she was able to walk again, even though her leg was about 1.5 inches shorter, and she used lifts in her shoes for the rest of her life. The downside of that, she also became a morphine addict. Drugs and alcohol really factored in with Evelyn for many years of her life, even after she was married and had children. So, for example, here's a picture of Evelyn when she was just a lovely young woman, and she looked very innocent and very beautiful, with that beautiful Hope diamond and the Star of the East in her aigrette. That's what that's called, that little feather on her hair. And then there's this picture of her, very much transformed. I love the look. I love the very drama queen look, where she's got the veil and she's got the fur and she's got the cigarette. But look, it disturbs me because look how thin she is. She has no hips. It's almost as though there's nothing. She has no legs. She has no muscle tone. It worries me about her. I'm worried about her. And she said in her autobiography that during the time that she was having this morphine addiction, that she had no appetite. And what she did try to get down, it wouldn't stay down. It wouldn't stay on her stomach. And so basically she just drank and took morphine to keep herself alive, which isn't much of a life. And you can see what happens. Luckily, she kicked the addiction and she was able to recover and and become a joyful person that she always was. So this really is just the first time we're going to be talking about Evelyn Walsh McLean. She has so many wonderful stories and so much jewelry that I want to devote at least another and maybe two more events with her. The one that I want to do, the next one is the Hope Diamond. I want to do a pattern inspired by the Hope and the stories around that particular diamond and her association with it. First, I just want to give you a sense of who Evelyn was. Now, when I first started hearing stories about Evelyn, I thought for sure that she was just a very unserious person, a real ditz, a real irresponsible, kind of vulgar, a little bit crass woman. But as I got to know her through her autobiography and read about her childhood, it made more sense to me. What I realized was that Evelyn was she was bright, she was independent, she was observant, she was generous, and she wanted to live life joyfully. And I love that about her. So let's talk about how she grew up and how that might have shaped her sort of what some people might say recklessness, but I like to think of it as her joie de vivre, basically her love of life and wanting to live every single moment. In my view, when you get that proper context of where she grew up and how she grew up, and then what she moved into, her words take on an entirely new meaning. Evelyn Walsh was born in 1886 in Denver, Colorado. Her father, Thomas Walsh, was an Irishman who came to the United States in the mid 1800s, and he ended up going west and following the gold rushes that were happening at that particular time. Now, he wasn't necessarily a prospector himself. He really became successful in providing the goods and services for the prospectors, the miners, and actually the mine owners. However, he also spent a lot of time looking at the land and learning from the prospectors. His passion was to explore the forgotten, kind of abandoned tracts that prospectors who were in search for a quick success had abandoned very quickly. They hadn't really fully searched it. Thomas Walsh met his wife, Carrie Bell Reed, in a little town called Leadville, Colorado. Don't you love these names? You know, there's Deadwood, South Dakota, there's Leadville, Colorado, there's Ouray, Colorado, all these wonderful mining camp towns that had sprung up during that time. You know, I'm from Nebraska, and all of my family, or much of my family, moved to the Denver, Colorado Springs area. And I remember going out to visit them and going to places like Cripple Creek, right? So I've got a little bit of sense of what that's all about. So Tom Walsh married Carrie Bell, and they had a little girl and eventually a little boy who they named Vincent. And they ended up in Ouray, Colorado, in Southwest Colorado. Now, I want to take you on a little journey to Ouray, Colorado, up the canyon to the top of the mountain where they ended up settling. This is the adventure that you would have to go through to get to that little mining town. Now, any of you have a little bit of a problem with heights, you might want to look away. And keep in mind that these are 21st century roads. Can you even imagine what they were like in the late 1800s? All right, so take a look. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? It makes me a little nervous. I'm nervous for the guy on the motorbike. During the time that Evelyn lived with her family in Ouray, her father would share all these wonderful stories of his experiences chasing the prospectors and the miners throughout the land. One of the places that he went was a place called Deadwood, South Dakota. And he talked about how Calamity Jane would walk the street in her buckskins and her rifle and her old, her plainsman hat. And she called Thomas Walsh by his first name. They were on a first name basis. He talked about people like Swill Barrel Jimmy and Antelope Jack or Sheriff Seth Bullock. One of the people that he talked about was an old, crusty prospector that came to him named Smoky Jones. Smoky Jones needed a bath and he needed a meal, and Thomas Walsh set him up. At that point, then, Smoky Jones asked Thomas if he would like to go in with him on a mine, a prospect that he felt was very promising. And Thomas Walsh did a lot of research, and he heard from the people who knew that it was not a good deal. He should walk away from it. And so he told Smoky Jones no. Later, Smoky Jones staked the claim at Homestake Mines, which became the highest producing gold mine in that time period. And Evelyn wrote about that in her autobiography. She wrote that Tom Walsh learned his lesson. So I'm reading from The Queen of Diamonds on page 18. She writes, "But where another man might have gone on being foolish, my father buckled down to learn all he could on mining, of nature's customs, of her whims in depositing precious minerals in the earth. He learned from experience, out of the minds of other men and even out of books. To the last year of his life, he was ready to point out with grim satisfaction that while those dogmatic Colorado mining friends had been among the first in the Black Hills rush, not one of them had acquired any of the great properties of that region. What had cheated them, he used to say, was not a matter of luck, but their own technical prejudices." As for Tom Walsh, 10,000 times in his succeeding years, he stooped to pick a bit of float or to chip a specimen from an outcrop that another mining man would have passed by without pause. If it had not been for that habit, he might have indeed died poor. But for that habit, there might have been little out of the ordinary for me to tell. So little Evelyn Walsh played all over Ouray, Colorado. She ran barefoot in the streets. She and Vincent with other kids would play games. And one of the games that they played was firemen, and they succeeded in burning down an old empty shack and getting very, very much in trouble for that. But they had also had some real life and death experiences. Life up in the mountains is close to the bone. Close to the bone. In fact, one evening they were taking the train from Denver back to Ouray, and as they were going through the gorge and coming around the curve, another train, a cattle train, hit them head on. There was a terrible loss of life. The trains went off the track, fell down the gorge. Luckily, the Walsh family all survived, but there was loss of life from both people and animals. In fact, Evelyn talks about in her autobiography how an old man who tried to speak to her about his wife and his babies died in her arms when she was probably 8 or 9 years old. Another instance happened that really changed Thomas Walsh's idea about staying in Ouray, whether it was wise or not. He was going up to Ouray from one of those very steep canyons, as you saw, and the horse he was riding saw a wagon that had fallen off the cliff. Right? It had been an accident. And there was a shirt, like an old coat, blowing from the staves of one of the wheels that had been busted. And the horse shied, went nuts, kind of reared up, thinking it was a bear. And Thomas and the horse almost went over the cliff as well. They almost died as well right there. So that was the point at which Thomas Walsh said, you know what? I think the mine is fine. We're going to go east and we're going to go to Washington, D.C. And so that's what they did. So Evelyn ended up going back east to Washington, D.C. in 1896. So think about this. Evelyn spent the first 10 years of her life as a wild child. She ran barefoot. She played. She had adventures. She had experiences that most humans don't have, let alone a little girl in the late 1800s. She was around independent and fearless women and men. She was free to express herself, encouraged by her parents. So now consider the environment that Evelyn and her family left: wild, independent, fun, adventure, to the environment that they went to in Washington, D.C. in 1896. This was the Gilded Age. This was the time when extravagant, gigantic wealth now sat in positions of gigantic and extravagant power. You had US House of Representatives, you had US senators, you had Supreme Court justices, you had judges. It was a place of refinement and society. And Carrie Bell, Evelyn's mom, wanted her to become a lady so she too could swim in those circles of refinement and society. So they shipped her off to boarding school. They shipped her off to Dobbs Ferry. Evelyn was miserable. She was miserable, cried all the time, was terribly homesick. And this is what she said in her memoirs about that experience. She said, "I knew what was expected of me there. By some school magic, I was to become a lady. And a lady could do, so I was told, just about nothing that she might want to do except to attend all parties." Now think about it too. Think about what parties were like back then. They weren't supposed to be fun. Parties back in those days, especially in that circle in Washington, D.C., were a place where you would see and be seen, where you were trying to impress and outshine. There was a sort of, a real lack of genuineness, kind of a gossipy meanness, and a real cruel exclusiveness that kind of swirled around these parties. And Evelyn wanted nothing to do with it. And so that's why this backstory that I spent this time talking to you about is important to me. There is a story about Evelyn and how she went into Cartier in Paris. And she took with her two earrings, or a pair of earrings that she'd bought there, along with some additional loose diamonds. And she said to the manager of the showroom, "I want you to add these diamonds to these earrings." But the manager discreetly told her, "Madam, adding extra diamonds would be unsuitable for a lady." Well, Evelyn would have none of it, and she shot back to him right away. "Damn it, I'm no lady. Put the diamonds on." And he did. Now, when I first read that, I felt it was maybe the words of someone who maybe a tad bit crass, maybe a little vulgar, right? Kind of took pride in not being a lady or being something else. But what I realized after learning all of this backstory about Evelyn was that a lady to her was someone who she didn't want to be. She was much too serious for that. She was much too genuine. She was much too kind, much too generous than that. And she didn't want to be associated with being a lady because she was more than that. Does that make sense? So I'm glad we had a chance to be able to talk a little bit about this. So you can kind of get a sense as we move forward with Evelyn's story about who she was and what she wanted the people in her life to, how she wanted them to perceive her. Now, about those parties, Evelyn wanted her parties to be fun. And in fact, her parties became legendary. There was one activity that she liked to do for her parties where she would take the Hope Diamond and she would stash it under shrubbery or under ledges or under steps. And she would have her guests find the Hope Diamond, which I thought was just cracked me up. Other times she would take the Hope Diamond necklace and she would fasten it around the neck of her giant Great Dane named Mike. And he would wander around the guests and around the grounds. One time the necklace fell off and Mike lost the Hope Diamond. So it's probably good that her guests were pretty adroit at finding the Hope Diamond because they needed to use those skills to find the Hope Diamond that Mike lost. Now, there's also a story that's reported to be true that as guests were arriving to one of Evelyn's fabulous parties and they would walk into the wonderful, great foyer of their home, that some of them spotted Evelyn at the top of the great staircase. She was wearing the Hope Diamond and nothing else. So it's clear that Evelyn loved gemstones. Her first big major purchase was on her honeymoon. She and Ned McLean, Ned was from a family who owned the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer. They were newspaper people, and that's how he made his millions. But they went on their honeymoon in 1908, and they went all over Europe and the Middle East. And before they left for that wonderful adventure, both of the fathers gave them $100,000 each. Now, $200,000 in 1908 would be about $5 million today. They had $5 million to play with when they were on their honeymoon. There is one story that they needed two cars for some reason. They had shipped over her beautiful red Mercedes with them when they sailed over there, But because they felt that they needed to have some independence from each other and they needed another set of wheels, she bought another Mercedes while she was over on her honeymoon. The other thing she bought was this fabulous, wonderful stone called the Star of the East from Cartier. Now, the Cartier, they purchased it for what would be about $2.6 million today. So they blew half of their loot on that diamond. It's 92.25 carat pear-shaped diamond, and it is fabulous. She also bought the Hope Diamond about 3 years later, 1911. And of course, she's most famous for owning the Hope Diamond all of her life. She bought that for $180,000, which would be just a little bit less than $5 million today. Other diamonds came fast and furiously, including the diamond that we now know as the McLean diamond. That's the diamond that inspired this month's pattern. Now, Evelyn loved her jewelry and she loved wearing it too. Maybe she was trying to emulate some of her associates when they would go down to Palm Beach, Florida, and they would vacation down there. She had this to say about one of her acquaintances. She was past 60, and all her life she'd been accumulating jewelry. Maybe Evelyn was trying to emulate her. Who knows? Tiffany, the jewelry company, might have started a branch with what she wore, even when she went swimming. I hope this has given you an introduction into Evelyn Walsh McLean. We're going to talk about her more in the coming months. We'll talk about her wedding, her marriage to Ned. We'll talk about her children, her parties, some of the other stories about her, and especially her relationship with the Hope Diamond, which is the source of just wonderful, wonderful stories. But I wanted to give you kind of this overview of who she was, how she grew up, and what her attitude towards life was, that she didn't want to be stereotyped as a lady. She wanted to be fully and joyfully Evelyn Walsh McLean. Now, Evelyn died in 1947 at the age of 60 of pneumonia, just 60 years old. People say that, while it was pneumonia was the cause of death, that she really died of a broken heart. She had just lost her 24-year-old daughter, her youngest child, to suicide. Probably unintentional, but it was a combination of sleeping pills and alcohol that killed poor Evie McLean. Evie had been married for 5 years to a man who was 40 years older than Evie was. She married her. She was 19 when she married a senator who was 58. They'd had a big argument. Oh, they had a child together. The child was 4 years old after when Evie passed away. But the senator and Evie had a big fight, and Evie went upstairs and locked the door, and a combination of sleeping pills and alcohol took her away. Evelyn never got over that. It broke her heart. She left 74 pieces of jewelry, 74 pieces of fabulous jewelry, 4 of which had names: the Hope, the Star of the East, the Star of the South, and the McLean diamond. Harry Winston bought all of it. He bought the entire grouping of her jewels, and he actually put it on display. It was a traveling exhibit that went around to cities in the United States called the Court of Jewels. People loved it. And some of those jewels ended up in private collections. So for example, the McLean diamond ended up in the possession of Wallis Simpson, or at that time known as the Duchess of Windsor. Now, we could talk for 3 months about the Duchess of Windsor. In fact, we're going to talk in future months about the Duchess of Windsor, because she truly, truly was a drama queen, and she had stunning, stunning jewelry. When the Duchess died, her entire jewelry collection went on the auction block at Sotheby's in 1987. It was originally intended to go for about $7 million. It went for $45 million. That's how much it brought in. And the portion of the proceeds went to the Louis Pasteur Institute to fight AIDS. It was purchased by a man named Tsuneo Tagaki, and he was a Japanese gem dealer. And there aren't any records since then about a sale of the McLean diamond. So people tend to think that Mr. Tagaki still has the gemstone. Let's talk about that diamond now. Let me describe to you a little bit in gemology terms what our McLean diamond really is. It is 32.26 carats. It's a cushion cut diamond, and it has a color that is a D grade. So it's D color, and it has a clarity of a VS2. So what do I mean by all of that? Cut, color, clarity, and color. Those are the four measurements by which gemstones are graded, particularly diamonds. It was invented by the Gemological Institute of America, or the GIA, which is the preeminent source of education and grading of diamonds in the US and the world, actually. If you want to learn wonderful things about gemstones, you can go to gia.edu, their website. Got great articles, fabulous pictures, and I think you'll have a good time. You can also sign up to become a certified gemologist, a graduate gemologist. So you can get your GG at the GIA. I have thought about that at one point, but you know what? There's just too many quilts to make, and I only have so much time, right? Time and money. That's all it's about. So what I mean by this is carat. It's 31.26 carats. Carat is the measurement of physical weight of any gemstone. A carat, a single carat, is 0.2 grams, or a fifth of a gram. If you're talking about measurements that it's used in all other parts of the world except the United States. In the United States, we use ounces, and it would be a 0.007 ounce is 1 carat. So if you wanted to find a gemstone that was a whole pound, if you found something that was just this massive, gorgeous gemstone, why? Wouldn't this be fun if it was real? This is a little glass sculpture that I use to help describe to people how gemstones are literally a series of windows and mirrors. Windows on the crown where the light comes in and bounces back out. And in the pavilion, these are the facets on the bottom where the light just bounces, 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 and then comes back out through the windows. But this little guy, I think this might be about 2 pounds, 1.5, 2 pounds. But a gemstone that is 1 pound would be 2,265 carats. So that's a big gemstone. Okay, now what is cut? A cushion cut. Cushion cut has been around for about a century. It is also known as a pillow cut. It is a lovely gemstone that could either be square or rectangle, and it has rounded edges and slightly larger facets. The slightly larger facets show off the internal clarity of a gemstone. So you can see how cut and clarity are very much associated. So if you are going to have a gemstone that has a clarity rating of a VS2, and I have a chart here that shows you the various measurements of clarity. VS2 is pretty high up there. It's pretty much that you can't see the inclusions by naked eye. You'd have to find a microscope to find any of the inclusions, the little fractures, or even extra little elements. Sometimes you have diamonds growing within diamonds, or certain gemstones growing within a gemstone within diamonds. It's amazing, the inclusions, and I'll show you some pictures of some inclusions in just a minute. But yes, if you have a gemstone that is a very, very high clarity, whether it's flawless or a VS or a VS2, you want to cut that gemstone so that it it showed off the clarity internally in that gemstone. So for example, emerald cuts and baguette cuts. Remember, emerald cuts are those beautiful long steps of color, the long bands of the facets. Oftentimes they're called gemstones the Hall of Mirrors, because they have those long hallways of facets. And what that does, it allows you to peer inside the gemstone and really marvel at how beautifully clear a gemstone really is, the clarity of it. Now, something like a brilliant cut that has a lot of facets in it, that just basically has that light bouncing, bouncing, bouncing around and popping back out. You can have a gemstone that has a few more inclusions, even perhaps inclusions that you can see with the naked eye without a microscope, because that bouncing of light will mask the actual inclusions themselves. So when we have the McLean diamond has been graded as a VS2, or very slightly included 2, it was cut as a cushion cut to show off that lovely interior clarity. Now here's another tip, or another little piece of information. Before before the GIA codified all of these measurements, long ago, they often talked about a gemstone's clarity in terms of water. So the clearest diamonds they called diamonds of the first water. Isn't that amazing? So the clear pools of light that show. And so we have cut, we've got that. Color. Okay, let's talk about color. D. This is a D grade. And that is colorless. Absolutely no color at all. It's not tinged with gray. It's not tinged with slightly yellow, which is kind of the next level, D, E, F, G, H, all the way to Z. They have identified gemstones with that color grade. Why did they start at D? Well, up until that point, diamonds had been graded many different ways by many different organizations, and they'd used the letters A, B, and C. Because there was no uniform grading system, there was no standard, it was hard for people to talk about what does an A grade really look like? What does a B grade? You know, some people have different views of what that would look like. And so when the GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, decided to start their grading process and start really codifying how to look at gemstones and diamonds in particular, they said, you know what, let's just let A, B, and C be. Let's just let them have that. And let's start with D. So there's no doubt at all that if someone sees an A, they won't have to wonder, was that the old grading system or is that the new GIA grading system? So they said, let's start at D and let's have that be the perfect colorless, beautiful, limpid gemstones that you see that are, they call them D flawless, are the most beautiful gemstones. They are perfectly colorless and they are perfectly clear. They are exquisitely, exquisitely clear. So cut, color, clarity, and carat. So we've talked about all of those. It's also said that the McLean diamond has a very high level of brilliancy. Now let's talk about the difference between brilliance and fire. Brilliance is, okay, here we go. We're going to talk about windows and mirrors in this gemstone using my little glass sculpture. So here we go. In a gemstone, this is the crown of the gemstone. Everything above this really tiny, thin cut right here, this little facet, that's called the girdle. The girdle, as we all, thank goodness, don't have to wear a lot of those anymore, is the facet that separates the crown from the pavilion of the gemstone. The crown has several different facets. The crown has the table facet, the star facets, the bezel facets, and the upper girdle facet. Once you find the faceting pattern, when I start looking at a gemstone as a quilt, once I find its faceting pattern, I'm getting some clues as to how I'm going to turn it into a quilt block. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this, the crown of it, is, consider that as windows. That the crown is what invites light to go into the center of the diamond. Once it comes into the center of the diamond, it hits these facets on the bottom called the pavilion facets. Okay. And they bounce, 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 bounce around there. That's their purpose, is to bounce that light around. And then it shoots out, again, the top of the gemstone through the crown back to your eye. When it hits your eye as pure white light, that's called brilliance. And to get the most beautiful brilliance, you also need the dark bits. So you need that play of light and dark. Sometimes when that light bounces, and it bounces back up, it actually splits into the different frequencies. You see the red, the blue, the green, the purple, the orange. That's called fire, right? So brilliance is the white light, fire is the different colors. And when you see a gemstone kind of sparkle like this, that's called scintillation. I like to call that brilliance in motion. So our particular diamond, the McLean diamond, was said to have a very special type of brilliancy, meaning not only it was very clear, but it threw off a ton of light. That light would just come in there and bounce and bounce and bounce, and then just, explode through the top of the gemstone. Very similar to the finest diamonds that were found in the Golconda region of India. Now, it's called, the term they use is Golconda, Golconda. While it refers to a particular region in India, these days it refers to a particular type of gemstone. Basically, a gemstone that is very fine, that is clear, it's colorless, and it might have a slight tinge of blue. Since people do call this a Golconda diamond, it may give clues as to where it came from. It might have come from the region of India, the Golconda mines. There was a multitude of them. I think there were about 8 of them, long since vanished and depleted. But because merchants during that time, when they were beginning to trade the diamonds along the trade routes way back when, the merchants often kept their sources of their diamonds very secret, very close to the vest, because they wanted to keep those sources very private and very exclusive. So if you're talking about a Golconda diamond, sometimes it's very hard to find out the information about exactly what mine it came from, where it came from. Like you can, for example, with maybe emeralds and tourmalines and aquamarines from mines in, say, Brazil or Sri Lanka or other places. But the Golconda gemstones, you kind of have to say, well, maybe it's this region precisely because merchants kept that information so secret. This is the point at which I start looking at a gemstone not as a gem, but as a quilt pattern. And what I'm always looking for is how I can segment it up into pieces, into facets. What I'm always looking for is that through line, the edge to edge line that would separate a gemstone into 2 halves. And then I'll look at that half and say, what's the next through line that I can separate it into then quadrants? And then I further divide, further divide, further divide. That's going to allow me to then just, when I cut it apart, I can put it together just 2 pieces at a time, to units at a time, to sections at a time, and pretty soon I have my entire diamond. So in this case, I was looking at this gemstone and I saw these 2 diagonals. I said, those are my through lines. This is going to be just a 4 patch, kind of 4 triangles put together. What also I loved about this particular pattern were these fan shapes that really radiated out from the center. Now, I call that the culet. I think that's the culet of the McLean diamond. It appears that it's a little square at the very bottom there. And a culet is an actual facet that slices off this tip of a diamond, the bottom of the pavilion. Not all gem cutters add culets to their gemstones. Okay, not all of them do. A lot of them just come down to a straight point. But when they do shave off a little bit, that's called a culet, C-U-L-E-T. So what I loved about this gemstone was these little fans that went from the edges from the culet out to the edges. The other thing I saw were these little chevron shapes that kind of marched from the center out to the edge. Once I identified kind of its features, its signature features, I decided that I needed to really streamline it. I could have put 10 times more lines to represent facets in this gemstone, but you don't have to. Once you get that personality of the gemstone, you can turn it into a block that's going to be, I think, equally lovely, and it's not going to be a pain in the neck to put together. My earlier gemstones that I did back in 20 years ago, sometimes I had up to 35 colors in them, different fabrics. For my patterns these days, I really try to keep it much less than that, because one, it makes it much more simple, and two, it's costly if you have to buy a lot of fabric, and two, it's that hassle of having to find all that fabric and bring it into one project. So I'm really trying to simplify and keep the number of fabrics very, very simple on this one. What I also then did was try to throw those colors around the gemstone for the most drama, right? Tried to really create some bling there. And the way you do that is you put your lightest lights and your darkest darks together. That's what's going to create bling in your patterns, regardless of what your subject matter is. So if you are a pattern maker, if you are a quilt designer, and you want to bring people's eyes immediately to a focal point or lead their eye around your design, put the lightest lights and the darkest darks. That will be your focal point. That's what creates bling. Okay. And also with the bling, those high contrast areas, you also need some low contrast areas that kind of smolder. So I try to kind of bring that together in the gemstone in equal parts, but with asymmetry. What I love about the most interesting gemstones, or the images of interesting gemstones, is that they are asymmetrical, not necessarily in their cut, but in the way they disperse the light and the value around the gemstone, the light and the color around the gemstone. And why is that? If you look at a gemstone, sometimes you can find them. They're CAD, computer aided design produced images, and they are perfectly symmetrical, both in cut and in placement of color. They lay there like a lump of coal. That's because your eye has nowhere to go. It's those pools of light that then move into the pools of dark that lead your eye across the gemstone that gives it movement and gives it energy. So when I try to create my gemstones, I try to create them not only in asymmetry in terms of the different facets, the number of facets in each quadrant, but also in the placement of the fabrics to create asymmetry in light and color. So now let's talk about the pattern. I've talked with you a little bit about the inspiration for the pattern and then how I created a quilt block out of it. Now, what I'd like to do is go with you, walk through with you the different codes and what they mean, how to prepare your pattern for cutting it up. Let's cut it out together. Let's iron it to our fabric. Let's put it back together. Let's make a quilt block together.
Let's talk about Evelyn's Envy, the cushion cut gem pattern that I designed inspired by the McLean diamond. Here we have the pattern. I am looking right now at the 9-inch pattern. We have 9-inch, 12-inch, and 18-inch. Let me kind of just share with you a little bit about the pattern and the codes first. And then we'll talk about slicing up your pattern, both the 9, the 12, and the 18, and then how to put it together. So let's take a look at the pattern. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a pattern that has 2 through lines. These are the lines that I decided to use as the section divisions for my gemstone. So basically what we're talking about is this gemstone has 4 sections. Section 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can tell this because every single facet has a code on it. It's a hyphenated double-digit code. And up here at this very top triangle, every single facet begins with the digit number 1. That means this is section 1. And over to the right-hand side, it starts with the digit of 2, so that's section 2. Here we have section 3, and here we have section 4. And you can tell that because the digit that begins the hyphenated unique identifier is 3 down below and 4 over on the left. Now, the second digit is the actual facet, is the number of the facet within that section. So here's 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. All right, and those are all going to make up a unit. Do you see how I have kind of put those in order of piecing so that you can use the numbering order actually as your piecing strategy? And we'll talk about the piece plan that's at the back of this pattern that will help you put this gemstone together piece by piece, unit by unit, until you have a full gemstone. The letter code is the color code. That is the color fabric that you're going to use. You're going to actually iron that particular facet onto that color of fabric. Now, the reason I used numbers for the unique identifier and a letter for the color code is that if I used a letter or a number for the color code, all of these numbers would just make my head explode. So when I'm looking at this, I automatically know, okay, when I look at a C, that's the color. A, that's the color. When I look at this hyphenated number, I know that is actually the piecing, the unique identifier and part of the piece plan. So this is going to be kind of your key to show you how this is all put together. The subsequent pages are going to be the pages that you're going to print out on freezer paper. So for example, for the 9-inch pattern, you're going to print out pages 2 and page 3. So do you see, for this particular gemstone, for this size gemstone, it fit perfectly on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper when I sliced it in 2 on the vertical. So everything on this side of the line was able to fit on page 2, and everything of the center line was able to fit on page 3. So what I'd like to have you do is print 2 and 3 on freezer paper, and then what you'll do is you'll cut out around these edges, okay? And then you're also going to cut along this edge. What this little notation says is, please cut on this line right here, because you'll then want to place a strip of double-sided tape on this shaded area, and then you're going to lay the adjacent segment, this segment right here, on top of this area, aligning the facet. So we're going to do that in just a minute. Now, I could do that with the 9-inch. I could actually separate it out into 2 pages. But for the 12-inch and the 18-inch, I needed more pages to separate them out. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So the subsequent pages for the 9-inch pattern is page 2 and 3, which you're going to print out on freezer paper. And then on page 4 on the 9-inch pattern is kind of a colorway. It's kind of a coloring sheet. I have the same pattern that I had on the very front, but it takes off the unique identifier and just leaves the color code. And that is going to allow you to identify the colors that you want to use. Now, I already have provided you with a colorway, right? I have provided you with colors from light to dark and some medium tones in both Moda Fabrics, Kona Cotton, and Paintbrush Studio Fabrics Painter's Palette Solids. But because these are all in values, you know what? You can do these in any color values you want, any gradation of colors, any value progression of colors or hue that you want. If you just want to begin to play around with the color and just, not do a diamond, but do maybe an emerald or a ruby or a watermelon tourmaline or something fabulous like that. So that's on page 4 of the 9-inch pattern. Then subsequent pages talk about the supplies, and then we start into the instructions. So first thing you're going to want to do is, with the 9-inch pattern, print pages 2 and 3 of this particular document. And be sure to have the setting of actual size selected when you print onto your freezer paper. By printing actual size, this is going to ensure that your segments will print out exactly so they become 9 inches square. And this is the chart on the freezer paper that you're going to cut up. Now, when it comes to printing on freezer paper, make sure that you put your freezer paper in, and I'm using C&T's wonderful 8.5 by 11 pre-cut sheets in my printer. And you'll want to go ahead and print on the paper side and leave the waxy side down. You're not going to print on the waxy side. Why? Because this is the side that you're going to iron to the right side of your fabric. This is what adheres to the fabric. What I'd like you to do is read through all the instructions first before you dive into this. That's going to help get you sort of acclimated to what we're going to do, kind of give you a preview of what we're going to be doing. Then, as we go through this, what I'd like to have you do is now move to the back, and you'll see that there's something I call a piece plan. See, there's my piece plan for Evelyn's Envy. We are going to use the piecing order as our piecing strategy. And so with time, with practice, you'll get to understand how this works and how my brain works and puts these things together. But until then, if you need a little extra guidance, this is a step-by-step process of how to put these pieces together. And on the 9-inch pattern, that's page 10 through 14. Now let's take a look at the 12-inch pattern. The 12-inch pattern, it's obviously going to be 12 inches by 12 inches. And so I wasn't able to get just half of a section onto a single 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So what I decided to do was segment it up into 4 quadrants. So I have this upper left-hand quadrant, then I have the upper right-hand quadrant, okay? We have then the lower left quadrant and the lower right quadrant. And again, I have these little instructions where you can cut and then lay the double-sided tape so that you can put this together and it becomes a full 12 by 12. Now, what I'm going to suggest to do first is cut out the top 2 pieces and then slide those together, right? We're going to cut off here and it's going to overlay that on this section. Go ahead and cut off the top 2, slide it together, then cut out the bottom 2, slide them together, and then once you have the top and the bottom, then you can overlay the bottom onto the top. And we're going to do that in just a second. Oh, and by the way, you'll want to print out pages 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the 12-inch pattern. So you'll have 4 different pieces of paper, freezer paper, that you'll print out. So when it comes to an 18-inch pattern, I need to have a larger pattern, which means I just need to cut up my segments, my pattern, in smaller segments, or quote unquote smaller segments. And to do that, say this is going to be an 18-inch across here, 18 inches across here. What I wanted to do then, I ended up splitting it across this way, splitting it this way, and then just doing 2 more segments here. So we have segment 1, 2, 3, 4, which we'll put together, then 5, 6, 7, 8, and we'll put those together with the double-sided tape, and then we will put the top and the bottom together, and you'll have your 18-inch pattern. All right, and again, I have added a little bit of a margin here where you can put your double-sided tape to put it together. So we have section 1, then you'll have section 2, section 3. See how it's coming together? Section 4. I'm going to bring this up a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. So that's your top part right there. Then what we'll do is we come down here and we have 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I'm going to cut all these out and I'm going to tape them together with my double-sided tape. Wonderful stuff. And we will have our full pattern. Let's start with the 9-inch. I'm just going to take my Omni grip ruler and my rotary cutter. I usually use a rotary cutter specifically for paper, and then I have a special rotary cutter for fabric. So I use 2 rotary cutters, one for paper and one for fabric. So let's go ahead and cut this little guy out. Just cutting along the outsides of the lines. Very good. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my double-sided tape. It usually helps to just take small little bits of the double-sided tape and drop it down here. And it's good to get double-sided tape all along the edge because you're going to eventually slice these up. And if you have a piece of paper on this side that doesn't have double-sided tape, you might risk losing a part of your facet. So let's go ahead and make sure that the entire edge is covered with double-sided tape. There we go. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my other side and I'm going to line it up. And I'm going to make sure that all these little lines are aligned. All these little facet lines are aligned. And you know what? Close is good enough. Perfection is not a priority with my patterns. Now, here's what I'd like for you to do. You've got a series of markers here. You're going to use 2 different markers, okay? Do you see how there is now a line running down the center of your pattern? This is a line that might get confusing to you as you're going along and just slicing up all the different facets. So we need a visual clue to tell us This little line right here, do not cut this line. It kind of looks like a facet line, but you see if I cut this line right here, do you see how that would split facet 1/6? It would split section 1/9. It would split section 1/12. You don't want that. You want all of this to be of a piece. All of this to be of a piece. All of this, and all of this. So what I'm going to suggest you do is something like, just kind of go across it like this. Maybe just some jagged lines, just as a visual clue to say, I am not going to cut on that line. Absolutely not. Okay, so now that you've got that visual clue, the next thing I'd like for you to do is to take another color of highlighter, and I want you to mark around the inside perimeter of the pattern, and then on either side of the lines that delineate the sections. Now, why are we going to do that? It's because that the edge of the block and the edges of the section are the parts of the block that sometimes get stretched and twisted and warped out of shape because you're working with them over and over again. And so by marking them, that gives you a visual clue that you may want to put it on the selvage edge. So when you're looking at your pieces all cut up and you see a facet with a yellow line on it, you're like, oh, could this be a piece? This is an edge that's going to be on the edge of the section or the edge of the block. Is this something that I want to put on the selvage edge? Now, for example, there's going to be some exceptions. So for example, here we have this wonderful piece, 115. Do you see 115 right here? This has this long, lovely edge right here. You're going to be piecing a lot of sections to it. This is going to be the edge that will have the yellow mark on it. If I were you and I was looking at this just standalone, I would probably put this edge on the selvage as opposed to this edge. So there are exceptions to the rule. Why? Because this is the longer edge. I either put the edge that has the yellow on it or the longest edge, or the edge, for example, of a needle nose facet that's going to need all the help it can get by the structure of the selvage edge, the straight of grain. You want to put the longest edge of a needle nose facet on the straight of grain, or something that lays along the section edge. And so you'll have to make some decisions. But let's go ahead now and put all of our highlighter marks around our edge. Okay, so the yellow is just your visual clue that that is the edge of the block or the edge of a section, and you might want to consider putting that on the straight of grain or parallel to the selvage. And what does this line mean? This means you are not going to cut on that line. You're not going to cut that apart. So really, we are ready to get started cutting with this particular 9-inch block. So I'm going to go ahead and take my ruler, and I'm just going to start slicing away. Now, sometimes you may have a tendency to maybe run off the edge a little bit or kind of go off the edge of one of your facets. That's okay. If you're not exactly on the line, again, perfection is not a priority with my gemstones. So just don't trim it up, because what you have added on one side, you have taken up with the other. So just don't worry about it. Just don't trim it up. Okay, so do you see? So do you see here how I have just gone a tad bit to the left of the line? A tad bit to the left of the line. That's okay. I am simply not going to trim that up, because what I have gained over here, I've lost here, and eventually it adds up to 100%. No problem. What I'll end up doing is just starting to cut all the rest of these pieces apart, and I'm going to put them in envelopes labeled with the color code, and I'm going to sort them by color code. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 12-inch block. So here's our 12-inch block. We have the upper left quadrant, the upper right quadrant, the lower left quadrant, the lower right quadrant. Let's go ahead and start slicing it up. Okay. Now, if you have little bits of tape sticking out like that, no big deal. Just rub your hand over it, or put a little, maybe baby powder or a little bit of maybe a washcloth, and get that stickiness off of there. Same with on the back. You'll have some little bits of it sticking out. Just go ahead and rub on it until that stickiness is gone, or you can put a little baby powder on it. Not a problem at all, and it will remove that stickiness. Okay, so again, what are we going to do? We are not going to cut this line. This is a line we are not going to cut. So basically, I'm going to take my highlighter, and I'm just going to kind of do this. I'm going to say, nope, I am not going to cut that line. No, no, no. There we go. There we are. My visual clue that I am not going to cut there. I'm going to cut every other line except this one and this one. So now what I want to do is take my yellow highlighter and go around all the edges of my block with the yellow highlighter, and also on either side of the diagonal line that separates the sections. And there we go. I am ready to start cutting. Do you see how I seem to always want to go off the line over on this far right one? That's okay, not a problem. I'm not going to trim it up. I'm just going to put it back together. As long as I can see the hash marks on both sides of the line, I'm good. I am not going to trim it up. I'm going to leave it just like it is. It's good. Now you know what to do with the 18-inch, don't you? Basically, we're just going to cut out each piece. We're going to put the first 4 together, laying this over here, laying this edge over here, and laying the far right edge here. We're going to put that top part together. Then we'll do this bottom part. We'll put it all together, overlaying the adjacent part across the double-sided tape once they're cut apart, and then we'll put this on top of the top part. We'll put the bottom on top of the top.